Hi, physiology people. Today we're going to start chapter 7 and 8, cardiovascular and blood physiology. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. Everyone loves the cardiovascular system. All right, let's go from the start here. So first we're going to begin with a quick review of heart anatomy, its chambers, and the blood vessels connected to it. And then we'll move into more physiology, the cardiac cycle and heart sounds, including those sounds that nurses must know through auscultation of the heart. Then we'll talk about the electrical activity of the heart with the EKG or ECG, either works. And then we'll talk about what regulates the heart's pacemaker. So let's get started. So for our review, I'm assuming you already know this stuff, but let's just go over it. So oxygen-poor blood returns to the heart through the biggest vessels, venous vessels known as the superior and down here inferior vena cava. They empty their blood into the right atrium, marked number 2. Then that blood passes through the tricuspid valve, marked 3, also known as the right AV valve, which stands for right atrioventricular valve. And then the blood enters the right ventricle, marked 4. Okay, the right side of the heart processes oxygen-poor blood that is on its way to the lungs, as opposed to the left side of the heart, as we'll see, processes oxygen-rich blood that has returned from the lungs. So, from the right ventricle, the blood must get to the pulmonary trunk, marked here as number 6, through a valve known as the pulmonary semilunar valve. So once that blood gets into the pulmonary trunk means from a tree, it's going to bifurcate. And these blood vessels bifurcate into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Now, I know they're colored blue in this diagram because they are carrying oxygen-poor blood, but like all blood vessels that leave the heart, they are called arteries. So this blood goes to the lungs, on the side, picks up its CO2, or drops off its CO2, picks up its oxygen, and then that blood returns to the heart, as all vessels returning to the heart are called, through veins, but they're called pulmonary veins. Marked here, the left pulmonary veins, and over here, the right pulmonary veins. That blood enters the left atrium, and it then goes through the bicuspid valve, also known as the left AV valve, also known as the mitral valve. Okay, so that then brings blood to the left ventricle, and from there, the blood will leave that ventricle through the aortic semilunar valve, right here, number 12, and then it gets into the aorta, showed number 13 here, that the ascending part is what's going up, the arch is what's arching, and then it turns down behind the heart into the descending aorta. Okay, so now that we know our heart anatomy and its chambers, let's move on into the circuits of blood flow in the body. So the first circuit is the systemic circuit. That is where blood that's oxygen-rich has entered the left ventricle, all right, the left atrium and left ventricle. That is the start of the systemic circuit. Systemic means whole body. So that arterial blood goes through the body in smaller arteries till it reaches body tissues, where oxygen is exchanged for CO2 waste. That CO2 waste in oxygen-poor blood returns from the body's tissues through ever-increasing size of venous vessels and returns to the heart with the superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, and that is where the systemic circuit ends, with the vena cava. Okay, so the pulmonary circuit begins at the right atrium. And so with that circuit, the blood is on its way to the lungs, all right, pulmonary circuit here, to the lungs, and then it gets its oxygen-rich blood, drops off CO2 waste, comes back with pulmonary veins, and so basically that is going to be the pulmonary circuit right there, okay? So it ends with the pulmonary vein. So 2 circuits of blood flow. One is the long circuit, the systemic circuit, and one is the short circuit from the heart to the lungs and then back again. So let's talk about what's really important as nurses or anyone in healthcare. One of the first things you do when a patient comes into the office is, well, you take their temperature, measure their body weight, measure their blood pressure, and then often you'll listen to their heart. And what you're doing is you're auscultating. You're listening for normal heart sounds. Now, what you're listening for is the sound of valves closing. So here's what's happening. During ventricular systole, you will hear the lub or S1 sound, because during systole, The what's happening is the ventricles have contracted and push blood into pulmonary trunk and aorta. Those pulmonary semilunar valves are open. So when that ventricle or both ventricles get ready to contract, you have to have the tricuspid and bicuspid valves closed. Because if they're open and when the ventricles contract, they could push blood backwards into the atria. So during ventricular systole, you will hear a loud snap called the lub or S1 sound of both the tricuspid and bicuspid valves closing. That's to prevent blood from the ventricles getting back up in there. Now, during ventricular diastole, now the ventricles are relaxed and filling. And now the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open because the atria are putting their blood into the ventricles. So to make sure that blood that's entering the ventricles doesn't get up into the aorta or pulmonary trunk, those semilunar valves must snap shut during this time. And that produces the dub or S2 sound. So let's listen to normal heart sounds. Let's make sure.
Okay, here we go. We'll get this connected again. Okay, or we will stop the share and we will pause for a moment. Okay, well, we did a sound check and we think we've got it working now, so we're going to go back to the share screen. Okay, so there we go. We're back. All right, so now we're going to listen to normal heart sounds. Lub dub, lub dub. Okay, I think you got it. Okay, so those are normal heart sounds. Now, asystole means there's no heart sounds, and that means someone's heart has stopped. So let's hope you don't hear that. But let's move on and talk about some different heart sounds or maybe some pathological heart sounds. So if we're looking at what's happening during ventricular diastole and ventricular systole, when the atria's valves are open and they are filling the ventricles with blood, that's known as ventricular diastole. That's when the ventricles are filling. That's when the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open, depositing their blood into the ventricles. At that time, the semilunar valves are closed. During ventricular systole, the ventricles are contracting and pushing their blood into the semilunar valves. Okay, that blood is now going into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. At the time that happens, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves must be closed when the ventricles are contracting. And so you can hear the audible sound of those events happening. And the important thing to note is that both the valves, the tricuspid and the bicuspid, when they close, they should close simultaneously. And the same thing with the semilunar valves. All right, when they close, they should be closing simultaneously. Now, here's what ventricular diastole looks like. The tricuspid and the bicuspid valves are open, the ventricles are filling. The semilunar valves are closed, okay? So during ventricular diastole, the sound of the semilunar valves closing would be the dub or the S2 sound. With ventricular systole, now, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves must close simultaneously, producing the lub or S1 sound because the ventricles are contracting and pushing their blood in the open semilunar valves. So you need the tricuspid and bicuspid valve closed at this time, or else the ventricles, when they contract, would push blood back up into the atria, and you don't want that happening. Okay, so heart murmurs. There could be innocent, non pathological heart murmurs or pathological ones. So let's start with an innocent murmur. In children, an innocent murmur can happen and can be fine, and they'll usually grow out of it. And what it is a quiet kind of whoosh sound between the S1 and the S2, or between the lub and the dub. Um, so now, if they don't outgrow that murmur, that could indicate a problem, but usually the children outgrow it. But a pathological murmur is when a murmur starts when you're an adult, and that usually indicates some disease process has set in. And that would be a whoosh between the S1 and S2, and it could be quite loud. Now, what this indicates, the whoosh, is the sound of blood backflowing in the opposite direction of which it should be going. That's called regurgitant flow. So that could be blood backing up from the ventricles into the atria. Now, something that can cause this would be aortic stenosis or stiffening of the semilunar valves leading to the aorta. And this can happen from a chronic inflammatory condition where over time the tissue has got scar tissue building up, and that scar tissue is stiff and inflexible, and those valves can't quite shut completely. Now, something that can cause an attack on valves is rheumatic heart disease, where your immune system has developed antibodies that attack the heart valves. In particular, it goes after the bicuspid valve. Now, this is a bad place to have an attack on a valve because remember, on the left side of your heart, that's all handling oxygen rich blood. And that blood, when it comes out of the left ventricle going into the aorta, um, that makes, if those valves are stiff and scarred from a chronic autoimmune attack, that could lead to regurgitant flow. Instead of when the left ventricle contracts, all that oxygen rich blood goes into the aorta, some of it could back up in the bicuspid and end up in the atria. So that means when the heart contracts, less oxygen rich blood is getting into the aorta. And so that's bad because the first tissue or organ to take oxygen rich blood out of the aorta is the heart itself. The common coronary artery comes off the ascending aorta. And also coming off the aorta at the arch is a common carotid artery. And that will become the left and right carotid arteries that are going to the brain. So the first organs that would lose oxygen rich blood with um, disorders of the valves would be the heart and the brain itself. Okay, so let's listen to an innocent murmur. Instead of instead of a nice lub dub, it's almost like a lub whoosh dub. All right. Okay. Now, aortic stenosis, that's when the aortic semilunar valve becomes stiff. Hear the whoosh? That's regurgitant flow of the blood. Okay. All right. Let's listen to a split S2. So instead of a nice lub dub, you get lub dub dub, lub dub dub, lub dub dub. The lub is there, but the dub sounds just like it's doubled a bit. Okay, and now let's listen to, and there can also be split S1s where it's instead of lub dub, it's lub lub dub. But anyway, let's listen to a mitral valve regurgitant flow where blood from the left ventricle is going back up the mitral valve or the bicuspid into the left atrium. Doesn't sound too good, does it? All right. So if you are one of my students and you're looking at that PowerPoint online, you can click this link here and it'll take you to the page where I found these sounds and many, many more. It's a good 30 minutes of listening to heart sounds. Okay, so let's talk about septal defects, especially when they're found in children after they're born. When a child is developing as a fetus inside the womb, there's some holes between certain chambers and blood vessels in the fetal heart. And that's not a big deal because the heart is still forming. But by the time that baby is born and becomes independent, if those holes haven't closed up, it's a problem. But when they're in utero and those holes are there, mom's circulatory system is providing all the oxygen and things that the developing embryo, not embryo, fetus needs, and taking away CO2 waste. But once a baby's born, they're completely autonomous. They need their heart to be functioning completely perfectly. So here's some common septal defects. The first one is called a patent foramen ovale, and that is a hole between the left and right atrium. So right here is the left atrium, and showing right through here is part of the left atrium, and there's a fetal hole still open. That's supposed to be sealed up by the time a baby is born. All right. The word patent means open, and foramen means hole, and ovale probably describes the shape of that hole. Okay, another common septal defect is there's a hole between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Okay, so here we've got the pulmonary trunk. Here's the aorta. And what we've got is a hole, all right, between the two. Now, let me back up here and explain why is this a bad thing? It's not a problem if oxygen-rich blood gets mixed with the oxygen-poor blood on the right side of the heart, because that blood on the right side of the heart is on its way to the lungs anyway to pick up oxygen. But what does matter is if low oxygen blood mixes with arterial blood, thereby diluting how much oxygen is in that blood. And then that blood starts going through all the arteries to the body. That means all the body's tissues, including the heart and brain itself, receive some cardiac cycles of oxygen poor blood. And that could lead to, an ischemic event, which is loss of really oxygen to tissues. Okay, here's another problem of ventricular septal defect. So the interventricular septum separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle, and this hole is in that interventricular septum. And again, the problem here is if oxygen poor blood mixes with oxygen rich blood, and then when the left ventricle contracts during ventricular systole, it ejects diluted oxygen blood into the aorta. And so the body's going to receive less oxygen when this happens. Okay, and there's a clinical app for that. And if we look at it here, okay, many defects can result in heart murmurs, and they're talking about septal defects right here. All right. Um, they mention here that septal defects can produce heart murmurs as well. Okay, so let's continue on. So this would be a review. This is a good time to go back through and review what we've learned until now. Next is going to be the electrical conduction system in the heart. So the heart is autorhythmic. What that means is the start for an action potential in the heart muscle happens spontaneously. It does it itself, okay? And where that impulse starts is in the heart's pacemaker or sinoatrial node. That is where it starts, okay? And then that electrical impulse, the action potentials, are propagated along this conduction system. So once the impulse starts right here, the little yellow dot, that's the SA node. Once the impulse starts in the upper right atrium, the signal immediately jumps over to the left atrium, and the atria will contract simultaneously, as shown in here in green. Now, after the atria contract, the signal moves to the AV node right here, that little green button right here at the base of the right atrium. Here, the signal pauses briefly before it continues down to the ventricles. This pause in the conduction of the action potential allows the ventricles to fill maximally. So when the atria have contracted, they've pushed the last amount of blood they had into the ventricles, and the signal pauses to make sure the ventricles have filled maximally. When that happens, then the signal goes down the interventricular septum, called the bundle of His. All right. Now, from there, it goes into the outer walls of the ventricles in the Purkinje fibers right here. And when it hits the Purkinje fibers, the ventricles contract simultaneously. So that's the conduction system, where the impulse jumps from one node to the next. Now, this is what it would look like. All right. Starts in the SA node. They don't show it here, but the signal jumps immediately over to the left atrium and they contract simultaneously, filling the ventricles. It pauses at the AV node to make sure the ventricles have filled. Then it goes down a bundle of His right here, and then it goes into the Purkinje fibers. Now, what it looks like is this. All right. Starts in the SA node, jumps over to the right atrium. They both contract. See, contract. Pauses briefly, then goes down the bundle of His into the Purkinje fibers, and the ventricles contract simultaneously. All right. So it happens very quickly. But notice that when the atria contract, they must contract simultaneously. When the ventricles contract, they must contract simultaneously. All right. So you can actually measure the speed at which these impulses go through the conduction system. And to do that, you use an electrocardiogram. So in an electrocardiogram, you have three primary waves. And it looks like this. The P wave right here shows what's happening with the electrical activity of the heart when both atria contract. Okay. So that's basically where the P wave, I'm sorry, the P wave right here This is looking at heart sounds, but what's happening here is the signal started in the pacemaker, the SA node, and it jumped over to the left atria and they contracted simultaneously. So that step is the P wave. Then the QRS wave is a very big deflection of when the ventricles are contracting. So this is ventricular systole. Then the T wave over here is showing ventricular diastole when the ventricles are relaxing and filling with blood. Okay, so P wave, both atria contract. QRS, both ventricles contract. That's ventricular systole. T wave, the ventricles are relaxed and filling with blood. That's ventricular diastole. Now, if you look at the heart sounds, you hear the S1, the lub of the tricuspid and bicuspid valves closing simultaneously, basically right here where the QRS is happening. Those tricuspid and bicuspid valves must shut simultaneously because the ventricles are contracting and you don't want regurgitant flow into the atria. Now, the S2 sound is heard before the ventricles relax here at the T wave. The S2 sound is now the dub, okay? So this is the sound of now the ventricles are relaxed and filling. The semilunar valves must have closed simultaneously. All right. So let's talk about the last thing for this lecture is how is the pacemaker depolarization regulated? Well, the signal itself is spontaneous, but what increases that rate of depolarization or increases or decreases it? So those things are affected by neurotransmitters. So in order to increase the rate of pacemaker depolarization, it's going to be sympathetic stimulation, all right, through thoracic nerves and cardiac nerves. Remember, thoracic nerves tense you up. That's fight flight. The neurotransmitter involved in a sympathetic response is epinephrine. Now, on the heart's pacemaker muscle cells, you have a receptor for that epinephrine that is a beta 1 adrenergic receptor. When that receptor is bound, ultimately that will open up things like sodium and calcium channels, and that will make the heart rate go up. Another way of saying this is that the rate of heart pacemaker depolarization goes up. Now, under rest and digest or parasympathetic control with the vagus nerve, the neurotransmitter for that is acetylcholine. And the receptor on pacemaker muscle cells is muscarinic cholinergic. Now, what happens when this receptor is bound? It opens up potassium channels, and that causes the heart rate to go down. So, we're reviewing a lot of chapters here with this summary. Chapter 4, Part 1, and also Chapter 4, Part 3, the peripheral nervous system. But that is a good place to almost end this. So, now, as I said with the previous slide, when the heart rate goes up, it's usually involving opening of sodium and calcium channels. Both those ion channels will cause the heart rate to go up. All right, so this happens when epinephrine binds to the beta 1 adrenergic receptor on pacemaker cells. Now, if potassium channels are opened up, such as happens when acetylcholine binds to its muscarinic cholinergic receptor on pacemaker cells, that makes the heart rate go down. Okay, all right. So what happens is, if there's epinephrine binding to receptors on the pacemaker, it will speed up the conduction cycle or the rate at which the signal moves through the conduction cycle. If it's rest and digest and acetylcholine's involved, it will slow the conduction cycle down. Okay, let's talk about some arrhythmias. So, an arrhythmia is an abnormal heart rate, and I've got a clinical app for that, which I'll show. But a normal EKG trace will show a normal rate of pacemaker depolarization and rest. So, that's what this normal rate looks like. Now, if there is tachycardia, you see that there are more QRS waves in a given time interval, and that's a higher than normal heart rate. All right, tachycardia can cause high blood pressure or hypertension. So, some treatments for chronic hypertension or chronic tachycardia would be, well, if you need sodium and calcium ion channels opened up for increase in heart rate, why don't you block those channels with sodium and calcium channel blockers? And that will decrease the heart rate, and that in turn decreases the blood pressure. Now, another way of doing this is to block the effect of epinephrine on the receptors by blocking the beta 1 adrenergic receptor. Now, this is review. There's a general beta blocker, propranolol, which blocks both beta 1 receptors on the heart, but also beta 2 receptors on the bronchioles. Now, a specific beta 1 blocker is atenolol. It'll block the beta 1 adrenergic receptor on pacemaker cells, causing the heart rate to go down. Now, the opposite problem of tachycardia is bradycardia, where the heart rate is too low, and that will cause hypotension. So, treatments for chronic bradycardia or chronic hypotension would be something to increase heart rate. Well, one thing that could do that is digitalis. Digitalis functions to increase the calcium available, and remember, calcium is a stimulatory ion, makes more of it available, and the heart, when it contracts, will contract stronger. The other thing would be to give them a beta 1 agonist drug like dobutamine, and this drug will stimulate the beta 1 adrenergic receptors on the pacemaker and increase its rate. Now, another thing you could do is to increase the epinephrine available to the heart's pacemaker. And so you could give an MAOI class A, and that would increase the amount of epinephrine available. And so more epinephrine means more stimulation of the heart's pacemaker. That's a great place. We've covered a lot of ground with the heart's electrical system, how you measure its electrical system, and then talking about what's happening in the heart's pacemaker, including how it can slow down with parasympathetic stimulation and increase with sympathetic stimulation. And then we talked about arrhythmias and drugs to treat them. Great place to stop for today. All right.